The Stonewall Riots were a pivotal moment in America's LGBTQ movement, but it was made particularly revolutionary by the fact that it was led by black drag queens. How did these riots come to fruition? What was their impact on the LGBTQ community? That's what we're going to learn all about in today's video. But before I break down the Stonewall Riots and why they mattered, I want to welcome back anyone who's seen my videos before and is subscribed, and welcome anyone who hasn't and isn't. If you're one of the latter and you enjoy and learn something from this video, you can get even more if you subscribe to my channel. In case you didn't know, I recently changed my channel's name from Laura's Perspective to The Autistic Advocate. To get all of it though, you'll have to tap that bell. That'll guarantee that your phone goes off whenever I post a new video essay that might interest you. First, let's talk about some important background information. In the 1950s and 60s, homophobia ran even more rampant in American society than it still does today. The few establishments that did welcome LGBTQ people and couples were run by organized crime groups due to the illegal nature of gay bars at the time, and bar owners and managers were rarely LGBT themselves. However, the last years of the 1960s saw activity among many social and political movements, including the Civil Rights Movement, counterculture of the 1960s, and the anti-Vietnam War movement. Those involved in these movements might not have known it, but another positive effect of their efforts was that they inspired LGBTQ people and activists to kickstart their own movement. In 1952, the American Psychiatric Association listed homosexuality in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, or DSM, as a mental disorder. Specifically, the medical profession firmly believed that trauma in parent-child relationships caused children to fear the opposite sex, and that was what made them homosexual. In 1974, homosexuality was officially removed from the DSM after review of a stunning 1956 study by psychologist Evelyn Hooker that compared the happiness and well-adjusted nature of self-identified homosexual men with heterosexual men and found no difference. Homosexuality is as old as humanity itself, but it wasn't until just recently that people were open about it. Before then, there were small gay communities who challenged gender norms in secret. The men in these groups dressed and acted feminine, and the women were tomboys, so to speak, either part-time or full-time. After World War I, people who'd fought in the war took advantage of the opportunity to settle in larger cities. As a result, the Manhattan neighborhoods of Greenwich Village and Harlem saw significant growth of LGBT communities. These communities took advantage of the prohibition, particularly of the private underground bars people set up so they could drink in secret. As secret gay bars grew in 1960s New York City, officers engaged in the act of entrapment. This practice involved an undercover officer who found a man in a bar or public park, then engaged him in conversation. If it headed toward the possibility that they might leave together, or the officer bought the man a drink, he was arrested for solicitation. One notable establishment frequented by gays and lesbians was the Stonewall Inn, owned by the Italian-American Genovese crime family. Since the inn didn't have a liquor license, the police allowed these bars to stay in business in exchange for cash payments known as gayola. The conditions of the Stonewall Inn bar were atrocious, unsafe, and unsanitary. Since there was no running water behind the bar, dirty glasses were run through tubs of water and immediately reused. There were no fire exits, and the toilets were often clogged. By 1969, Stonewall had a pretty good idea of how undercover cops worked and operated. So they made a new rule by which all visitors had to either know the doorman or look gay, preferably both. The interior was painted black, making it very dark inside with pulsing gel lights or black lights. If police were spotted, regular white lights were turned on, signaling that everyone should stop dancing or touching. This kind of vigilance was crucial because police raids happened frequently and without warning. Bar management usually knew about raids beforehand with the help of police tip-offs, and raids occurred early enough in the evening that business could commence after the police had finished. During a typical raid, the lights were turned on and customers were lined up and their identifications card checked. Those without identification or dressed in full drag were arrested, while everyone else was free to go. Some of the men, including those in drag, used their draft cards as identification. Women were required to wear 3 pieces of feminine clothing and would be arrested if found not wearing them. Typically, employees and management of the bars were also arrested. And now for the good part, the riots themselves. The evening of June 27, 1969, 4 undercover police officers came to the bar to gather visual evidence as the public moral squad waited outside for the signal. Once ready, the undercover officers called for backup from the 6th Precinct using the bar's payphone. At 1:20 a.m. that night, 4 plainclothes policemen in dark suits, 2 patrol officers in uniform, Detective Charles Smythe and Deputy Inspector Seymour Pine arrived at the Stonewall Inn's double doors and announced, "Police! We're taking the place!" The music was turned off and the main lights were turned on. Newcomers were confused, as they didn't even expect a police raid, let alone know what it would look like. But the seasoned veterans who'd been through this before realized what was happening and began to run for doors and windows in the bathrooms, only to find that the cops had blocked the exits. During this particular raid, bar attendees did not comply as they had in the past. Men dressed as women refused to go with the officers into the bathroom to have their genitals checked. Men in line began to refuse to produce their identification. The police decided to take everyone present to the police station after separating those suspected of cross-dressing in a room in the back of the bar. A sense of discomfort spread very quickly, which started when officers sexually assaulted some of the lesbians by, quote-unquote, feeling some of them up inappropriately while frisking them. After the alcohol search, in which 28 cases of beer and 19 bottles of hard liquor were seized, the lucky patrons who didn't get arrested stopped outside the bar, sparking the growth of a large crowd. The crowd became very quiet when a patrol wagon came to the inn to confiscate the alcohol. The police began escorting mafia members into the wagon to the cheers of the bystanders. Next, regular employees were loaded into the wagon. A bystander shouted, "Gay power!" Someone began singing, "We Shall Overcome," and the crowd reacted with amusement and general good humor mixed with, quote-unquote, growing and intensive hostility. An officer shoved a person in drag, who responded by hitting him in the head with his purse as the crowd began to boo. Pennies, then beer bottles, were thrown at the wagon as a rumor spread through the crowd that patrons still inside the bar were being beaten. A scuffle broke out when a woman in handcuffs was escorted from the door of the bar to the waiting police wagon several times. She escaped repeatedly and fought with 4 officers, swearing and shouting, for about 10 minutes. She had been hit on the head by an officer with a baton for, as one witness claimed, complaining that her handcuffs were too tight. After an officer picked her up and heaved her into the back of the wagon, the angry crowd became a violent mob. Their anger only intensified when officers tried to restrain some of the crowd, knocking a few people down. Some witnesses claim that a few of those handcuffed in the wagon escaped when police left them unattended. As the crowd tried to overturn the police wagon, 2 police cars and the wagon with a few slashed tires, left immediately, with Inspector Pine urging them to return as soon as possible. The commotion attracted more people who learned what was happening. Someone in the crowd declared that the bar had been raided because, quote unquote, they didn't pay off the cops, to which someone else yelled, "Let's pay them off!" Beer cans were thrown and the police lashed out, dispersing some of the crowd who found a construction site nearby with stacks of bricks. Garbage cans, garbage, bottles, rocks, and bricks were then hurled at the building, breaking the windows. Witnesses attest that flame queens, hustlers, and gay street kids, the most outcast of the gay community, were responsible for the first volley of projectiles, as well as the uprooting of a parking meter used as a battering ram on the doors of the Stonewall Inn. The mob gathered some of this thrown trash and set it on fire, then stuffed it through the broken windows as the police grabbed a fire hose. Because it had no water pressure, the hose was ineffective in dispersing the crowd. In fact, it only motivated them further. At one point, the police were heavily bruised by the flying debris, and one even had his eye cut. The police were absolutely livid at the idea that they had not only been defeated, but been defeated by gay people. With larger numbers, police detained anyone they could and put them in patrol wagons to take to jail. The Tactical Police Force, or TPF, tried to clear the streets by marching slowly and pushing the crowd back. The crowd countered this by forming spontaneous kick lines and singing the following lyrics. "We are the Stonewall girls, we wear our hair in curls, we don't wear underwear, we show our pubic hair." By 4 a.m., the streets had nearly been cleared. Many people sat on stoops or gathered nearby in Christopher Park throughout the morning, dazed in disbelief at what had just gone down. 13 people had been arrested. Some in the crowd were hospitalized, and 4 police officers were injured. Almost everything in the Stonewall Inn was broken. Inspector Pine had intended to close and dismantle the Stonewall Inn that night. Payphones, toilets, mirrors, jukeboxes, and cigarette machines were all smashed, and people came from all around the city to check it out. News of the riot spread quickly through Greenwich Village, fueled by various rumors as to who might have organized it in the first place. Graffiti appeared on the walls of the bar, declaring, "Drag power, they invaded our rights, support gay power, and legalize gay bars," along with messages accusing police looting and a message that the bar was open despite the state it was in. Later that night, there was a second series of riots around Christopher Street. Many of the same people returned from the previous evening, but they were joined by police provocateurs, curious bystanders, and even tourists. At one point, Christopher Street was so crowded that they had to spill into some nearby blocks. The same throwing of debris and burning of trash that happened the night before took place the night of the 28th. There were also kick lines, police chases, captures, and arrests like there were the night before. The riots themselves stopped at 4 a.m., but things didn't quite go back to normal right then. At that point, they had to deal with the aftermath of the riots. Those who'd heard of and even witnessed the riots reacted in many different ways. Many were moved by seeing and hearing of the LGBTQ community standing up for their rights and wanted to take action to expand on this. They held meetings and conferences about how to promote and ensure better treatment of the LGBTQ community all around the world, but particularly in America. For the past 4 years, the Machine had been performing an annual picketing event, the Annual Reminder, in front of Independence Hall in Philadelphia as nonviolent protests for gay rights. In wake of the Stonewall Riots, the 1969 Annual Reminder deviated from its original rules of having both the men and women follow a strict, modest dress code. Soon after the riots, formed one of the first official societies for the advocacy for gay rights, the Gay Liberation Front. And this was the first organization to use the word gay in its name too. Inspired by the Stonewall Riots, the 1969 Annual Reminder, and anti-war demonstrators, the GLF adopted more militant and confrontational methods in contrast to the meek civil disobedience of previous annual reminders and other nonviolent LGBT protests. The Stonewall Riots also sparked the gay pride movement we all know of today. Christopher Street Liberation Day, on June 28, 1970, marked the first anniversary of the Stonewall Riots with an assembly on Christopher Street with simultaneous gay pride marches in LA and Chicago. These were the first gay pride marches in U.S. history. It was actually because of this that June is known to this day as National LGBT Pride Month. So how and why do we remember the riots today? The Stonewall Riots are actually so historic that there's a monument to this event, and the inn itself is considered a landmark. In June 1999, the U.S. Department of the Interior included 51 and 53 Christopher Street and the surrounding area in Greenwich Village into the National Register of Historic Places, the first of the significance to the LGBT community. In a dedication ceremony, Assistant Secretary of the Department of the Interior, John Barry, stated, "Let it forever be remembered that here, on this spot, men and women stood proud. They stood fast so that we may be who we are. We may work where we will, live where we choose, and love whom our hearts desire." In May 2015, the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission announced it would officially consider designating the Stonewall Inn as a landmark, making it the first city location to be considered just for its significance to the LGBT community. On June 24, 2016, President Obama announced the establishment of the Stonewall National Monument site to be administered by the National Park Service. The designation, which followed transfer of city parkland to the federal government, protects Christopher Park and adjacent areas totaling more than 7 acres. The Stonewall Inn is within the boundaries of the monument, but remains privately owned. The National Park Foundation formed a new nonprofit organization to raise funds for a ranger station and interpretive exhibits for the monument. To this day, the LGBTQ community sadly still finds themselves fighting to have equal rights with straight people, but the Stonewall Riots set an example for all generations of LGBT of just how to do it. The riots themselves were seen as a symbolic call to arms and was a start for LGBTQ people and communities to be a little more able to be who they are publicly rather than stay in the closet their whole lives. As I mentioned earlier, the riots sparked this entire LGBT pride movement that's so prevalent today. The Stonewall Riots weren't exactly the first time LGBT people publicly fought against bigotry and homophobia, and it wasn't the last time they had to, but it's some of the most famous. The Stonewall Riots matter because they were one of the earliest public shows of LGBT power and pride, and are literally the reason LGBTQ people are slowly working towards having more and more rights. In case you didn't already know, My channel is now called The Autistic Advocate and is dedicated to video essays on human diversity and social justice. If that's what you're looking for in a channel and you like today's video, both figuratively and literally, subscribe to my channel and tap the bell icon so you know when I've posted new content. In the meantime, check out a review I've done on an LGBT novel and a playlist on all of my social issue essays thus far by clicking the links on your screen. Hope to see you back here next time and/or at my other 2 channels.